I just was immediately taken by just the hook of the story about this outside editor arriving at the Boston Globe and on day one informing his news team that he wanted to go after the Catholic Church. In some of the stories he'd been reading in their paper. And I thought that was just a really exciting beginning of a story. And as I started to really dig in with my co-writer, Josh Singer, and research the story, it just opened up, I thought, beautifully, and the characters involved were just captivating. What's fundamentally important about this story is it was an example of really strong local investigative journalism that had at first a national impact, then, as you know, a global impact. And I think that's an important thing to remember, especially today, where investigative journalism and the journalism industry in general has taken a huge hit. The thing just kept opening and opening and opening up. And as we know, it was both, I think, exhilarating and horrifying what they were discovering along the way. Incredibly painful, but, interviews with many of the survivors and families of victims. And I don't think anyone really had any sense of the scope until the Boston Globe reported on it so thoroughly and completely. We took the train up to Boston and we sat down with the reporters, first and foremost, the reporters involved with the story. And then from there, we kept returning to Boston and returning to Boston and returning to Boston and sitting with other reporters, publishers, editors, past and present. We were tracking them down in different places. Then we started looking at and interviewing some characters who were involved on the periphery of the story, lawyers and people involved in school systems, anywhere we could that felt like they were giving us a different sort of viewpoint on the story. The reporters, they're going after the story, they're going after the cheese, as they like to say, but they still are human beings, and they had to experience it firsthand too, in terms of what was being recounted to them, and some of the just the details were just incredibly upsetting. Even now, to watch the movie or to read about it, it's incredibly upsetting. So I think they had to live it. And I think that gives our audience an opportunity to experiencing it through their eyes. If there's ever a reason to say, hey, uh, we need strong press, we need strong investigative journalism, this is a perfect example why, right? We need people holding people and institutions in check. And that's what I think great journalists do. Marty pushed them on two fronts. First, legally, that they were going to sue the church for sealed documents relating to the case that had never been done before. Secondly, he put spotlight on the case. Now, Spotlight is sort of the crown jewel long-term investigative unit of the Boston Globe. It's comprised of four reporters at the time: Walter Robinson, Mike Resendez, Sasha Pfeiffer, and Matt Carroll. And that putting spotlight on it was sending a clear message that he was taking the story very seriously, and a clear message to the paper that he was an editor who was very committed to long-term investigative journalism. As a journalist, this is the type of story you wait your whole career for, right? It has massive relevance to your readership, and as it turned out, to the rest of the world. As you said earlier, it had a global impact. Very few stories have a global impact. You don't get used to it, but you start to desensitize a little bit. You have to do the work. You can't, we interviewed a lot of these survivors. We sat with family members of victims, and we've heard a lot of stories, and they're all so painful. And I think, as opposed to just being dragged down by it, in a sense, we were inspired by them, inspired to tell their story. And I think they certainly were incredibly supportive of us doing that. There was the physical abuse, but there was also the spiritual abuse. That look in times, for those of us who consider ourselves spiritual people, when things are really bad, that's when we lean on our spirituality. That's when we need it the most, and that was robbed from them simultaneous to this abuse occurring because it was happening at the hands of the church, at the hands of a priest. So a lot of these poor people, men and women, were left with no coping device. Mitch Garabedian was the first one that was demanding to take all these cases to court. You got to credit the guy for that, and the Globe picked up on that and exposed it. We do have a great cast, and I think the thing that gets me most excited about this great cast is the ensemble quality of it. They're just so great at feeding off each other and taking turns on taking the lead or taking center stage. But Mark Ruffalo, Michael Keaton, Rachel McAdams, Brian Darcy James, Liev Schreiber, and John Slattery make up our reporters and editors at Spotlight or at the Globe. And then beyond that, we have Stanley Tucci and Billy Crudup and Paul Guilfoyle, and I'm sure I'm leaving out some. The cast just goes on and on. Each actor spent their own time trailing these journalists and really getting to know it. And I think it's look, no one knows who these journalists are, right? They're sort of the unsung heroes of the story, and they don't have really a public presence. But the depiction by each of these actors of these journalists is just spot on. It was really exciting to see. They showed up; these actors showed up ready to go. They had all trailed and spent time with these, and they all kind of formed these friendships with the journalists. They felt like it was a movie that had something to say. Look, at the end of the day, our job is to tell stories, but it is nice when we feel like the movie actually has something to say. And I think they all connected with that, and they connected to the script, and they connected to the characters. The state of journalism in our country, I don't think people really understand just how dire it is, and this is a shining example of how our society benefits from a strong, free, professional press. But it's on the local level. And I think that's important to remember that this story, this movie, is based on the Boston Globe's reporting. That's a local paper that cracked this, and they're probably the only people who could have cracked it. But that local story became a global story because of how thorough the reporting was. They have yet to defrock priests based on this. They've got to start dealing with this. First and foremost, it just has to be transparency. I mean, what we're talking about is child molesters. So we have a way of dealing that within our legal system, and I think the church should be held accountable. And they haven't yet. They're not dealing with it yet. It's a really fascinating story, wonderfully acted, and that's why I go to see movies. I don't go to learn anything. I don't go to be taught. I go to see a good story, and I think it's like an incredible. That's why I made the movie. I think it's an incredibly compelling, interesting story, and at its heart, it's a procedural. Who doesn't love a procedural? It's just really exciting to see these reporters uncovering this story and dealing with it in a way that feels uh, honest.